Welcome to the panel, everybody. So, as Jake mentioned, we're here to talk about CBDCs. We're going to start by talking about what they are. It could be, is it anything from something that we either don't need to worry about? Is it potentially the next best convenient thing in the history of money? Or is it the final boss of shitcoins, talking about, following on from what we were talking about earlier, is it the ultimate shitcoin or the ultimate segue into a dystopian nightmare? So, simple question, just to start out with. I'm going to give this one first of all to you, Daniel. What is a CBDC?
Yeah, sure. I'll just introduce myself real fast. I'm Daniel. I'm founder of Hardblock, which is an exchange which makes it easy to DCI.
Absolutely. Bitcoin only.
Bitcoin only, of course.
Of course, yep, but it's worth mentioning.
And we also do an Australian Bitcoin podcast when we interview guests and teach people about Bitcoin. But yeah, to get to your question, JP, preparing for this panel, I tried to find what's the definition of a CBDC, and I honestly can't really find a good definition. I think different people have slightly different things in mind. And arguably, we already have a CBDC because the current money is pretty much completely digital, and it is controlled by central banks. But I think actually when people say CBDC, what it comes down to is the governments are trying to recreate the financial system from the ground up, an attempt to recreate the financial system from the ground up and create a digital kind of dollar using more modern cryptography technology.
Yes, I was going to say, because of course the dollar that we have at the moment is digital,
that's
virtually.
Correct.
No one, I mean, the amount of actual physical cash in the world represents a very tiny proportion of the total money supply.
Exactly.
So being digital, of course, is no great innovation at all. So why do you think it is that this is relevant to our conversation? Why are we talking about this particular central bank digital currency? What is it that they're trying to co-opt and use to do that?
The key thing is the key criteria for them is that they can control the issuance, the supply, they can decrease and increase the supply, and they can have control over it. Mm-hmm. That's the key differentiating, that's the key thing that they're trying to do. So using more modern cryptography technology and computer science project.
Well, they're using using blockchain, aren't they?
Yeah, well,
that's what we talked about earlier.
Yeah, because when you mentioned before in the panel, people say, "Oh, we don't like Bitcoin, but we like this blockchain thing," and I think that's what they mean about it, right? It's the idea that we don't like this kind of decentralized money, all this stuff, but we like the technology, the blockchain technology. So that's kind of what they mean. They mean using more advanced cryptography. But there was a pilot recent by the Australian government, and in it they're obviously doing it on a blockchain. But interestingly enough, they said that this is, for this specific example, they're doing it for a blockchain, but they're open to not using a blockchain for the CBDC. So that's not part of their criteria to use a blockchain.
Well, we'll have something to mention about the use of the blockchain a little later on. But for now, I'd like to go to Tarik. Now, you've been studying this phenomenon, this what's being proposed extensively.
Thanks,
give us your definition.
Yeah, I suppose I better introduce myself and why I'm even up here. Why is a medical person up here? So I'm a surgeon in Adelaide. I guess my qualifications to be up here on this panel relate to the fact that I've lived in 4 different continents and I've used 3 different types of fiat in my day-to-day life and transferred a lot of money across different countries. And so I sort of understand a bit about the fiat game, but I'm also a government stooge in the sense that your taxpayer money pays my salary as a person who works in a public hospital. So I do have some understanding of how government bodies tend to work. As far as what a CBDC is, I'm very clear on what it is. A CBDC is a government-issued cryptocurrency that is pegged to their local fiat. And so in the case of the US dollar, that would be something like a USDC, but that the government controls. In the case of Australia, there's an Ethereum-based stable coin that the government is already trialing in conjunction with banks like ANZ. And it will basically be the Australian dollar on the blockchain. As far as controlling the issuance, it's no different than what they currently do. They currently control the issuance, but it will facilitate, putting it on the blockchain will facilitate certain aspects. And I guess, I'm not sure if you were going to ask me the next question, the devil's advocate question.
Well, it is very interesting that you mentioned Ethereum again. I mean, doesn't it just go to show how different the values are in that these people, essentially their wet dream is to be the bedrock upon which government-mandated central bank digital currencies are instituted. I mean, this idea of this sort of thing could not be more antithetical to the goals of Bitcoin, and yet these people claim that we're all should be friends, and that it's all you know, run off holding hands together in the sunset. If only we weren't so toxic.
Can I, just in the devil's advocate role, can I?
Well, that's what I'm going to get to. I'm going to ask you to do that. Sure. So before the brickbats come out, I'm going to ask Tarik. He's volunteered to take the hospital pass and essentially act as devil's advocate to perhaps explain to us why other people. I mean, we're obviously under no illusions about that there'd be anything good about it, but why would other people perhaps think that there's some reason to adopt a digital currency? What arguments might they use to lure people into accepting such a thing?
Yeah, so I guess I should qualify this as well by saying that I'm not a fan of CBDCs.
Absolutely not. No.
I don't. I would much rather the Australian government just adopt a Bitcoin standard and move on. But unfortunately, I don't think that's what's going to happen.
We're living in the real world. This is what's attempting to be thrust upon us.
And so I do think CBDCs are going to happen, and they're going to happen in Australia within the next few years. And I think as Bitcoiners or as noobs that are here to listen to this talk, we should understand the values and the benefits of what they are trying to achieve in order so that we can have an answer when it happens. The government is not going to adopt a Bitcoin standard because they currently have a certain amount of control over the currency. And so their view, playing devil's advocate, is that they just need to improve the current system in their mind. And so what would a CBDC achieve from the government's perspective? I think there are some benefits, not as good as Bitcoin, but there are some benefits. The first would be faster and more efficient transactions. So for example, if I lived in America for a year, I wanted to send Australian dollars to America. That was very difficult. I lost a lot of money and it was very slow. If the American standard stablecoin and the Australian standard stablecoin, the CBDC, were to be transacted on a blockchain, that process would be much faster and cheaper. So that's one benefit. Another benefit would be better control over things like criminal activity. So if somebody genuinely uses cash to buy drugs, that would be much more difficult if cash did not exist. So from the government's perspective, policing the population for legitimate criminal activity is easier if you can see where the money's going. There's also better control over welfare payments. So if somebody is getting paid welfare by the state, they're more able to control what that money is spent on. So for example, not being spent on smoking and alcohol if that's what they wish to police. So that's another potential benefit from the government's perspective. And finally, and the one I think is actually useful, is cutting the bank's lunch. So currently, the big four Australian banks make a lot of profit off doing not much other than distributing the currency from the government to the people and to institutions. When you have a central bank digital currency, it is likely that you will no longer need a retail bank. And so, in theory, the retail bank's profits go back into the government's coffers because they don't need them to distribute the money. So from a government perspective, those would be the devil's advocate benefits of having an Ethereum-based shitcoin AUD. Is it worth the trade-off? It is absolutely not worth the trade-off, and I think we need to speak to Ketan and others about how we try and minimize the impact of CBDC on our society.
That's it. Now, before I go on to Ketan, we are going to get to Ketan because before the audience needn't worry, we are going to knock all of this down. And thank you, Tarik, for that, just for setting up what those reasons are. But before we do that, you had a slightly different perspective, didn't you, Daniel, when we were talking earlier about what at least what the threat of this is. You have a somewhat more neutral perspective. Perhaps we shouldn't be that worried before.
I think we should be worried. I think probably I would say maybe the solution is different. I think what we should be doing is promoting Bitcoin because in a sense we already have a digital currency and a lot of these things, the controls, you can implement them in the current online banking systems. Whether it's the code is in a blockchain or in your online banking portal, you can have controls that control how you spend money. You can freeze people's money that happen with the trackers in United States, in Canada, sorry. So a lot of that stuff is already possible. And really, I think the solution is to promote and enable Bitcoin and fight the government on, I believe there's a little more and more restrictions on Bitcoin, regulations that hamper on-ramps and things like that. And I think that's what our focus should be on fighting that.
All right, well, look, what we'll do, I think, let's hear from Ketan. Ketan, let's knock it all down. Give it the, demolish this, because, you know, we all think we generally understand that there is a potential threat here to liberty and so forth.
Yes. So. Well, hello everyone. My name is Ketan. I am the co-founder of Ministry of Nodes. We provide Bitcoin education, mostly on YouTube and one-on-one consulting sessions and those sorts of things. But what are some of the cons of central bank digital currencies? Well, I think the first con is that it consolidates power into one particular entity. And that is dangerous. That is extremely dangerous. They can implement things on the network, on their network, to restrict and prohibit certain things. So if I was to give you an example of that, something like you've reached your allocation of fuel for this week or this month. You can't buy certain things at the petrol station anymore. So those are, that could be one thing, or airfare tickets or something like that, right? Because there might be some restrictions to put on that. The next thing that could potentially go wrong, and I'm not saying that these guys, the CBDCs will come out, saying that this is what's going to happen. I think this will be probably some sort of slow approach, or even something like an emergency use situation. So that might be something that they try to implement over time, rather than coming out with CBDCs. They're going to start off with, it's efficient, it's great, it's going to let us, stop crime and fraud and those sorts of things. But then what about the consolidation of power? And then other things that they could probably implement is, and one of them would be timeframes on money. So you could say that, okay, they'll launch some, Chuck E. Cheese token out to the world with an expiration date. So you must use your currency now or within this time frame, otherwise you lose it. And so what does that have to do, what implications does that have on, savings and how we build civilization upon savings? There is a bizarre reason, there is literally a war on savings. They don't want you to save, and I don't know why. Well, I kind of do, but the incentives are for you to not save and go into debt. And there's a reason for that. So they don't want, intergenerational wealth, those sorts of things. We've seen it with the superannuation industry. They're trying to restrict that as much as possible. They're getting boomers to spend all their money instead of passing it on to the next generation. These sorts of policies and initiatives can be easily done through central bank digital currencies. They can go really totalitarian, things like restricting where you can use that money. So within a geographical location, so maybe within 15 kilometers or a 15-minute city, for example, they might just say you can only use it within here. It can get really dystopian very, very quickly. And the thing that really stops them from doing that now, I believe, is cash. So things like negative interest rates can't really happen when you've got cash. And so, when you have negative interest rates, they're telling you, okay, well, you've saved some money, we're going to take a haircut. They can't do that if they've got, if you've got it in physical cash. It's much harder to do. Whereas if they do it, they can just rip it out of your bank account. And so these types of, policies or monetary policies that they would like to experiment with can really, really start to go haywire very, very quickly. So I would warn and challenge and push back on central bank digital currencies, particularly when they're going to frame it like, oh, it's going to stop crime and it's going to stop, it's going to be more efficient. You'll be able to send payments all the time. Well, they're probably going to freeze it. They're going to probably, put on restrictions. These are easily done on central bank digital currencies.
You made an interesting point there that I'd like to pick up on, and that was this idea that they could put the expiration dates on the money, and you asked rhetorically, well, why would they want you to spend your money? And of course, we know that we live in a Keynesian economic system, which requires constant economic growth. But the problem with that, of course, is we live in a world of finite resources. And so the very monetary system we've got, which that would perpetuate, forces the continual exploitation of the Earth's resources. Yet they complain about Bitcoin's energy use all the time. When in fact, it's a point perhaps I should have made in the earlier panel, but from this point of view, Bitcoin actually becomes the most environmentally friendly thing ever. Because now you've created a system whereby rather than forcing people to spend their money, the whole system doesn't rely upon the need for constant economic growth. And it also incentivizes, for the first time in a long time, people to save their money rather than spend it. And so think of all of the useless crap that people buy because they really don't have a lot of incentive to save. Compare that with the Bitcoiners. You don't see most proper Bitcoiners, no matter their wealth, driving around or acting in a particularly flashy way because they have this incentive to save. So think of the carbon footprint that's been saved by all of that consumption that didn't actually need to happen. And so central bank digital currencies are certainly, from that point of view, much less environmentally friendly than Bitcoin. Tarik, you've got a chance to redeem yourself from your comments before on pro-DDCs.
Yeah, in fact, I'm gonna agree with Ketan on everything he said.
Yeah.
I think there are two things that haven't been mentioned, which I think need to be mentioned, which is when there is a central bank digital currency, and I think there will be, I don't think it's stoppable at this point, there are going to be two issues. One is universal basic income. So I think the sweetener to adopt the e-Australian dollar will be, here's $1,000, use our shitcoin. So that's probably how it'll be introduced to the population, and I think that needs to be resisted. Secondly, they will probably stop you being able to buy Bitcoin easily, because once you are on a CBDC standard, it'll be much more difficult, or I should say be much more easy for them to say you can't spend this on Bitcoin, whether that's through limiting centralized exchanges or otherwise. And I think that's actually quite a big danger, because then the single biggest alternative, and the reason we're all here today, becomes harder for people to gain mass adoption with. And so there is no rebuttal. I agree with what Ketan said.
Absolutely.
We
always knew you did.
Yeah. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that these questions as to what the advantages of CBDCs are will keep coming up. And it is our responsibility, in fact, it's our duty as people who like Bitcoin or embrace Bitcoin, understand it, to see their talking points and be able to answer them in a way that is civilized and makes sense. I think rebelling in the streets without a rational argument is probably not going to work. So I would rather us think about it before it comes and use the next few years to build up a rebuttal that makes sense, so that when the CBDCs come, at the very least, we still have the option of using Bitcoin and increase its adoption through our society.
Thank you for that. No, that's terrific. Now, Daniel, do you think, from your experience, that whether or not we should be worried on the point of view, do you think perhaps the government may be not sufficiently competent to pull this off? I mean, and perhaps you could tell us why that might be.
If they were, you know yourself, like if they were competent, they wouldn't be using a blockchain.
Exactly.
Like, so that tells me they don't know what they're doing. Because, I mean, like blockchain is made for decentralized money. It just complicates it, the way things doing it.
So fill your boots, use blockchain.
I kind of differ with Tarik. I think it's gonna take them some time to do it, because creating this kind of new money, very risk averse, and they don't, when they're dealing something with money, they don't want to destroy the current financial system. So, and they don't know what they're doing. So I think it's going to take them time to figure things out.
You know how long it took them just to get the cards to work on the bus? You know, they had this in Singapore. Like, but anyhow. Now, Tarik, well, this is a good segue into the next part we're going to cover, is how far ahead are other countries? Can we take any example in terms of what other countries have been doing and where they might be at with this?
We had a brief discussion about this before as well. It's not just the governments that you're up against. Yes, the governments are relatively incompetent with new technologies. There's no question about that. The hospital system I use at work is absolutely not fit for purpose, and it interferes with my ability to treat patients. And that's a more fundamental and easier problem to solve. But it's not just the governments. The retail banks are currently on side with the idea of a central bank digital currency. ANZ, for example, is openly a partner and has been trialing an EAUD stablecoin. And they have the knowledge to do it. So it's not just the government, it's also retail banks at this point in time. As far as other countries, the EU yuan is already in use on a trial basis. Almost every developed nation is in various stages of either implementing or studying central bank digital currencies. The US, which is obviously one of the leaders in the quote-unquote crypto space, there are multiple retail stablecoins that are currently in use and trading at high volumes. They're not government issued, but I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, something like the Circle stablecoin becomes co-opted as the national CBDC of the US. It's a local based company that is trying actively to become a bank. If they become a bank and they issue USDC, and the US government gives it its blessing, it becomes a de facto central bank digital currency because it's pegged to the US dollar. So I don't think it's that far away, depending on where you look, especially somewhere like China where it's actually in use.
Well, the question now is, what are we going to do about it in Australia? Or indeed, and for those overseas, what could you do about it with your respective countries? And I think I'll go back to Ketan to kick this one off.
Okay, so for me, I think there's two things that we can actually do to somewhat push back, and that is to educate. Education around what central bank digital currencies could present, but also educating around Bitcoin and its use, and what it's there for and what it's designed to do. I think everyone in this room, whether they're new or they're old, can help people to educate others around what is money. Just ask them basic questions around what are properties of good money. These sorts of things and these discussions need to be had around Australian dinner tables. And we also need to push back on narratives as well. So I know on Twitter, everyone's kind of moving over to Nostr. Nostr's great. It's a great echo chamber. But Twitter is mostly where I see a lot of the Bitcoin discussion happening. And if narratives come through that are completely wrong, there should be someone who stands up and says, hey, this is wrong. And if you agree with him, you should ratio
exactly.
that tweet. And so it costs very, very little for you to hit the like button to show that you are in support of this idea and to make sure that a bad idea is not being, proliferated on.
There's nothing better than seeing those sort of some corporate shill somewhere getting ratioed the shit out of them by a bunch of laser eyes on.
Yeah. So if you don't know, like a lot of the social media stuff does happen on Bitcoin, happens on Twitter, and I think it is a great place for others to see. So it's not just the Bitcoin echo chamber that's in there; it's for other people to watch and make a decision and make a call. That's what you're doing. You're trying to educate and rubbish bad ideas and promote good ideas. And I'd like to see more of that.
The Reserve Bank of Australia has a Twitter account, and feel free to ratio them about Bitcoin at every opportunity. They're on there because they want to be on there, and I think they deserve to hear what the people want to say.
Agree.
Yeah.
And then the other solution that I think that we can all engage in is creating a circular peer-to-peer economy that does not involve the use of CBDCs. So creating alternative systems. If you've got a product, if you've got a good, if you've got a labor or a skill, I'd like to hear about it. I'd like to see that you're accepting Bitcoin for your time and your labor and your efforts, because that payment option could mean, I don't get tracked, or I don't get surveilled, I don't get a social credit score put on me. And that's something that I'd like to see. So please, if you've got something to offer to the world, accept Bitcoin as a payment method for it. I'd like to see more of that.
Terrific. Thanks, Ketan. We've got about 7 minutes left, but I will just get Daniel first and then Tarik, just to follow up on that in terms of perhaps you might even think that you might not necessarily think we need to do much in terms of combating. Maybe we're just better off working hard on Bitcoin. What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, that's right. CBDCs are the ultimate shitcoin, even worse than Ethereum, I would say, so you know that's bad. And if people are free to choose and buy Bitcoin, they will make the choice to buy Bitcoin, not CBDCs. So all we have to do is make sure people have the choice and ability to buy Bitcoin. Perfect. That's all we have to do.
Anything to follow up there?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I do believe in the role of government. I just think it needs to be a democratic and sensible process. I don't believe in the surveillance state, but I do believe in the role of a government. And I think, as a government employee, I probably couldn't treat the patients that I treat without there being a government. It would be very difficult. I would like to see Bitcoin being, at the very least, a viable alternative, and for people to be able to have the choice whether to use the government shitcoin or to use Bitcoin. And I think as a population, as citizens of Australia and other countries, I think we should vote with our feet to make sure that at the end, that's what is the bare minimum acceptable standard that we have, is to be able, if we wish to transact in Bitcoin as we please.
So speaking of Bitcoin, final pitch, Ketan, with the last few minutes that we have. Why is Bitcoin fundamentally different to the prospect of a central bank digital currency?
So I think as I mentioned, the first thing is that central bank digital currencies, they consolidate power into a specific one area. Whereas Bitcoin is a decentralized approach. Making these draconian changes onto the Bitcoin network is going to be met with absolute fury. You will not be able to change the monetary supply without overwhelming consensus. And nobody in their right mind would think that they would want to debase their own money. And so that, I think, is probably the biggest selling point for Bitcoin, is that it removes control from guys who wish to, control populations and control money, and allows more freedom to prevail.
Perfect. Thanks, Ketan. Any final remarks, Daniel and Tarik?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Yeah, Bitcoin is decentralized.
Yep.
Doesn't have a CEO. That's the difference.
Buy Bitcoin, and when the time comes, vote against the CBDC being the only option that you've got.
Perfect. Thanks, Tarik. Well, we've got a few minutes to spare, but we'll leave it there. Let everyone get a bit of an earlier lunch than they otherwise would. And thanks, guys.